The tools that a hunter uses to bring down the beasts in Monster Hunter World are vast and varied, but none are more important than the weapons they use. I'm Darcblade, and in this series of the Monster Hunter World weapons, we are going to take a look at the various weapons and tools of the game. In this episode, we're going to bring you an overview guide of the Gunlance. The Gunlance shares many similarities to the standard lance weapons. It's very defensive, however, instead of focusing on thrusting attacks, it utilizes an inbuilt firearm. This, however, does not make the weapon a ranged weapon whatsoever. Think of the firearm portion of the weapon as more of a close-range shotgun, allowing you to utilize slashing attacks with the bayonet portion of the lance, coupled with shelling attacks. These shelling attacks are also a unique function that allow the Gunlance to bypass monsters' resistance, allowing it to do damage without the hindrance of a monster's defense. But anyway, let's move on to the basics of the Gunlance. Now remember, for the purpose of this video, I will be quoting PlayStation controls. However, you can either look down in the description below for converted buttons, or work them out yourself depending on what system you are using. The first basic move for the Gunlance is the lateral thrust. This is done by pressing triangle. It's a straightforward thrust with the Gunlance that has a decent reach. Next is rising slash, which is done with triangle and circle. This is an upwards attack that can help hit flying monsters or hit a monster's weak point if they're in a high position. Next is shelling. This is done by pressing circle. This will utilize the firearm portion of the Gunlance. And then next is quick reload, which is circle and R2. Every time you use the shelling function, you will use up one of the shells indicated in the top left corner next to your weapon sharpness bar. Next you have guard, which is done by holding R2. This will allow your hunter to block a monster's attack. Whilst guarding, you'll also have access to a few other moves. These include guard thrust, which is done by pressing triangle, and reload, which is done by pressing circle. One of the highest damaging moves available to the Gunlance is only available while you're guarding. This is called Wyvern's Fire, which is done by pressing triangle and circle, but we'll talk about that more in the unique functions. Now of course there are more basic moves available to the weapon that utilize things like the environment or sliding down hills, but we'll talk about them in the more in-depth video. Anyway, let's move on to the unique functions available to the Gunlance. First is shelling. Shelling is the term used by Monster Hunter for firing the Gunlance's firearm portion of the weapon. These unique shots deal fixed damage to a monster's part regardless of that monster's resistances. This comes in incredibly useful against monsters who have high defenses. For example, the shelling attacks won't bounce off a monster's hide. Whilst utilizing your shelling attacks is optimal for maximum DPS with the Gunlance, you have to be aware that shelling attacks also consume a large part of the sharpness gauge. If you keep using shelling attacks, then you will eventually blunt the weapon. Once the weapon is red, you won't be able to use them until you've resharpened the weapon once more. So always keep a whetstone close by. The next unique function is the Wyvern's Fire. Whilst guarding, holding R2 and then pressing triangle and circle, you will unleash Wyvern's Fire upon a monster. This is a very high damage move, but has a few drawbacks. One, the wind up time for the attack is quite long, so there's a chance you will either miss or get hit in between. The other downside is it comes with a substantial recharge time. Once you've cast Wyvern's Fire, you'll notice that the top of the weapon is glowing, indicating that it's overheated. You won't be able to use Wyvern's Fire again until this is cooled down and returned to the normal weapon's colour. So with that in mind, it's best to use Wyvern's Fire when you know a monster is incapacitated or stunned. The next unique function is the WYRMSTAKE cannon. The WYRMSTAKE cannon is another attack that utilizes the firearm portion of the weapon. Once used, this attack fires a blade that will hit a monster multiple times and then explode. Afterwards, you'll notice in the top right hand corner underneath the sharpness gauge is the WYRMSTAKE cannon. Once this is red, it means it needs to be reloaded. Now you can cast the WYRMSTAKE cannon in one of two ways. You can either cast it after multiple shelling attacks, so that would be circle, circle, and then the third circle would fire the WYRMSTAKE cannon, or you can use it in a longer combo string, which we'll talk about in the basic combos. And the final unique function is something to be aware of, especially if you're interested in the Gunlance for when the full game releases. This is the shell type. Basically in the main game you'll have different shell types available to different Gunlances. These include normal Gunlances that offer the most ammo, long Gunlances that offer the longest range when it comes to shelling attacks, and wide Gunlances that offer limited ammo but have a higher damage spread. But anyway, let's move away from the unique functions to talk about the basic combos. The first basic combo is a combo useful for getting close to a monster. This is done by pressing the left stick and triangle, 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 then circle. As I said, this moves your hunter towards the monster's location and then finishes off with a shelling attack. Next is a combo that I personally quite like, which is a quick combo that again finishes with a shelling attack. This is done by pressing triangle and circle for a rising slash, triangle, then circle. This combo is also quite useful because it has wide arcs. And then finally is a strong combo that utilizes the WYRMSTAKE cannon. This is done by pressing triangle and circle for that rise and slash, triangle, triangle, and then you can finish it with either triangle or circle, it doesn't matter. The final hit of this will be the WYRMSTAKE cannon attack. Just remember that once you've finished it, reload the WYRMSTAKE cannon with R2 and circle. But anyway, let's move away from the basic combos to talk about the pros and cons of the weapon. The major pro for the Gunlance is the shelling attacks. Thanks to the fact that shelling attacks bypass monsters' resistance, make it incredibly useful, especially against monsters that come with high armor. Utilizing shelling attacks in between your normal combos will ensure that you do guaranteed damage to a monster. Whilst the shelling attacks are not nearly as powerful as say the WYRMSTAKE cannon or Wyvern's Fire, shelling attacks can be utilized at any point, whilst the other two do have cooldowns and are best used against incapacitated or monsters who have their movement restricted. Just remember that with all of these attacks to keep an eye on your cooldowns and to reload your weapon when appropriate. The next major pro is that it's a highly defensive weapon. The large shield the weapon has is not just for show. You're able to block a lot of monsters' attack, and while you can't block every attack, it still comes in handy. After you've learned a monster's attack pattern, sometimes you'll notice it's better to block a weaker attack from a monster to ensure that you can do damage afterwards rather than just rolling away or even running away. But this will come with time and practice. However, the biggest con for the weapon is that you will drain the weapon's sharpness very quickly, especially if you utilize the shelling attacks. With that in mind, always keep a whetstone close by, and whenever a monster does run away, immediately resharpen your weapon before going into combat again. Now overall, the Gunlance is an interesting concept. If you haven't played the weapon before, you may think it is a long-range weapon with a shield, but in fact it's a highly specialised close-range weapon instead. It comes with good defensive options thanks to the large shield, but on top of that it's also got a lot of damage potential. As I already mentioned, the shelling function, ignoring monsters' resistances and defences, is probably the biggest pro for the weapon. On top of that, it has two very devastating attacks with the WYRMSTAKE cannon and the Wyvern's Fire that can deal high burst damage to a monster. Just remember though that the weapon will need reloading, and always keep on top of your weapon's sharpness. Due to the weapon's size as well, its reach is actually quite good, even its normal attacks. Whilst it may not be the most mobile of weapons, thanks to the large shield you're carrying around with you, it's not always a bigger issue. You just have to watch out for unblockable attacks from monsters. If you're interested in picking up the Gunlance, after practicing with it and learning the ropes and unique functions of the weapon, you'll find a very interesting weapon to take on monsters with. Now remember that these first series of videos are overviews taken from the beta of Monster Hunter World. Once the game is fully released, expect much more in-depth videos for the different weapons and tools of the game. So I hope you found this video interesting, and until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you an overview guide of the Gunlance in Monster Hunter World. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.